Russia will help Uzbekistan build nuclear reactors as part of an agreement signed during President Vladimir Putin's visit to the Central Asian country. Now, the project is expected to be financed mostly through a Russian loan. With a nuclear reactor in Central Asia now, Russia's global imprint is growing even further. To discuss this further, we're joined by Ben Aris, who's founder and editor-in-chief of BNE Intellinews and former Moscow bureau chief for the Daily Telegraph. Ben, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for joining us here on WION The World is One. You've had a vast amount of experience in Russia, as you were just talking about before the interview started. I wanted to understand with you, with the latest development coming from Uzbekistan, how do you feel the West will respond to Russia's growing influence in Central Asia?
There's not much it can do. The problem is that, Uzbekistan, Central Asia, it's about as far from the rest of the world as it's possible to get. And it's surrounded to the north by Russia and to the east by China. And to the south, it's corked up by the instability in Afghanistan. But the trade volumes with the rest of the world, which would be one point of leverage, simply doesn't exist. I mean, Uzbekistan does $10 billion of trade with Russia and $13 billion of trade a year with China. And the trade it does with the rest of the world, the EU, is negligible. Although Uzbekistan itself is trying to diversify its trade and do more business, but there's no leverage. And so the West, they can complain all they like, but there's very little they can do.
When Uzbekistan tripled its exports of uranium products to the European Union market in the previous year. Now, Russia has announced they are going to be making nuclear reactors in Uzbekistan. Through these nuclear reactors, do you feel those sanctions that were imposed on Russia are kind of just going to get negated because Uzbekistan is anyways trading with the European Union?
Indeed, there's several things going on here. Uzbekistan has been suffering from an energy crisis in so much as it used to be a net exporter of gas, and now it has to import. It did a deal with Russia in December and imports 12 billion cubic meters of gas because it's growing so fast. I mean, it's growing about 6% a year, and it needs to keep that up. And consequently, the gas has solved the worst of the energy crisis, and now these nuclear power stations that it's buying from Rosatom will deepen its energy security, and it'll also tie Uzbekistan more closely to Russia. And Russia's been very actively using its export of both nuclear technology and refined, enriched uranium in order to bind countries like Uzbekistan to it. I mean, these reactors come with a 60-year maintenance and fuel supply deal. At the same time, the European Union is trying to diversify away because it's also dependent on Russian uranium exports. Although, I mean, Russia's a big producer, but it dominates the processing of uranium. And somewhere like Uzbekistan, which has raw uranium, it doesn't process very much. And so it's sending some to France, which has limited capacity to process. The States is also dependent on Russian uranium. And in that sense, uranium has become the new gas. It's become a geopolitical tool to bind people to Russia, or at least to give it some leverage in its relations with countries like that. As far as the sanctions are concerned, I mean, the Americans have banned the import of Russian uranium, but then they've introduced this waiver system because they don't have any uranium that they can burn themselves. And the waiver system means that for the next 5 years, although technically there's a ban, everybody's going to continue to import. I mean, the US are going to continue to import Russian uranium for another 5 years while they try and build up their refining capacity.
Ben, I want to now shift focus to Russia's growing global ties. And most of it, which has come out in the last 2 years, I would say most of it has been strengthened in the last 2 years. Talk about Russia's relations with Iran, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, China. We've already seen Putin make 2 visits to China in the last 8 months itself. North Korea. Then there's Saudi Arabia and UAE. Let's not forget the kind of reception that Putin received in these 2 West Asian nations. Just last year, he got a hero's welcome over there. The African coup nations, so many Russian flags that we've seen in Africa where Western forces have been ousted by those nations itself. All this has happened, and majority of it in the last 2 years, it has been strengthened. Did the Western sanctions push Russia towards strengthening more global ties in the past 2 years?
Absolutely. I mean, this is Putin's gamble. I mean, what he did is he definitively broke off relations with the Western world, with Europe and America, by invading Ukraine. And he knew that was going to happen. And his gamble is that Russia can remake its relations or strengthen its ties with the global South. And what Putin is betting is that his complaint that the world's politics are dominated by the US hegemony is actually shared by a lot of other countries. And I think what's happening is that being proven to be true. The countries in the global South, in the Middle East, in Africa, they are unhappy. I mean, when Macron was touring in Africa, the sort of residual colonialism, resentment of the French colonials came out very visibly in so much as there were demonstrations everywhere he went. But then when Lavrov goes and tours Africa, he's welcomed everywhere he goes. And then they're doing deals. They're supplying gas, they're supplying grain, they're supplying nuclear technology, and all these fast-growing countries in the emerging world, they want that, and therefore Russia is seen as a friend. And on top of that, you've got the Soviet legacy, whereby a lot of people in Asia, in Africa, they were all trained by Moscow. There was this sort of druzhba narodov, friendship of the people, and lots of these leaders who are in place now, they studied in Moscow in their youth, where they got a first-class education. And that's all playing to Russia's advantage too. And I think the West has miscalculated. It's overestimated its political and economic clout when it comes to forcing or pressuring all these global South countries into joining their side and sanctioning Russia, or at least not doing business, because most of them are simply not interested. This is like, this is not our fight. This is a fight between the Europeans. It's nothing to do with us, and we're very busy like building up our economies and catching up and bringing living standards up to Western standards. And consequently, Russia is a partner there. And I think we've seen exactly this with Putin's trip to visit Mirziyoyev in Uzbekistan, is that at the end of the day, the Uzbeks are trying to sort of navigate between all these clashing rocks of global geopolitical problems. And at the end of the day, he's focused on growing his economy. And what does he need for that? He needs energy. And where's he going to get that from? He's going to get it from Russia. So he's done the deal. And I think this pragmatic mindset is driving a lot of what the global South are looking at when they're dealing with Russia. Is that, first and foremost, we have to look after ourselves and let the West have their ding-dong with Russia. But all said and done, we'd rather not get involved.
Definitely, certain amount of overestimation from the West side regarding how much their sanctions would affect Russia and what kind of clout they have in that part of the world. Clearly, Russia has developed its ties on everything apart from the West, and that is a major part of the world. And we are, of course, tracking this closely. Always a pleasure speaking with you, Ben. That was Ben Aris, Editor-in-Chief of BNE Intellinews, joining us from Berlin. Always a pleasure speaking with you.